Okay, so hi everyone. Today I want to tell you about our recent work on how to render Speckle statistics and on how to use them for better imaging. So if you shine a laser on a scattering volume, like a piece of soap or a slice of tissue, it gets scattered multiple times, and we get constructive and destructive interference, which leads to noise-like speckle patterns. And it may look like noise, but actually it has strong statistical properties. And for example, the speckles shift when we tilt the illumination. This property is called the memory effect. And simply put, it means that light coming from nearby directions is scattered to produce highly correlated but shifted random speckle patterns. Now, this is a very interesting property, which has numerous applications in imaging. And a lot of the research that I was doing in the last years has to do with ways to simulate, model, and utilize speckle statistics. And I want to tell you about speckle statistics today. So speckles and their statistics are encountered in imaging settings ranging from biology to security, medicine, remote sensing, and astronomy. However, the development of these applications is hindered by the fact that speckle properties are not fully understood. And with a good way to simulate speckles, we can advance this research and design better imaging systems. So one important application of speckle statistic or speckle correlation is the imaging through scattering work of Katz and colleagues. So the goal is to recover a clean image of fluorescent sources that are hidden from the camera by scattering layers such as tissue. And the speckle memory effect makes it possible to remove the effect of scattering simply by computing the autocorrelation of the speckle image. And a model for speckle statistics can help us investigate under what conditions this image for scattering procedure will work, and also understand how to improve it. Another application of speckle statistics is an adaptive optics focusing. The goal is to change the shape of a wavefront so that when it propagates through a scattering layer, it will focus at a sharp spot, as if the scattering layer was not there. So finding the wavefront needed to achieve focusing is a difficult calibration procedure, which normally needs to be performed separately for each focus point inside the volume. And the speckle memory effect makes it possible to adjust an already calibrated wavefront so that it will refocus at different points within some smaller neighborhood. So a good speckle simulator can help us investigate how large this refocusing range is, and also what wavefront adjustment can increase its size and improve it. So, and then yet another important application has to do with material acquisition, meaning that we want to capture an unknown material in the lab and recover intrinsic characteristics of it. For example, we may want to extract nutrition facts of a food, vegetables, or detect tumors inside the body, and so on. And if we know to model speckles, we can capture the unknown material in the lab under multiple illumination and viewing conditions. And then we'll try to seek material parameters which will best explain the captured statistics. So with these speckle imaging applications in mind, I want to tell you today about two recent projects from a group. The first one deals with a new physically accurate way to simulate speckles, and it takes as input viewing geometry and material parameters, and allows us to generate speckles under different illumination conditions with consistent memory effect correlation. And we can compute how this correlation will decay as a function of different material parameters, for example, the function of the thickness of the material, the density of the scattering particles, their type, the anisotropy of the phase function, and so on. And it's physically accurate in the sense that it provides the exact same statistics as we would have got from an exact solution to the wave equation. So the second project is about using some things that we learned from the simulator to design better imaging system and see inside scattering tissue. And I will start with the simulator. So let's see how speckles are usually simulated in optics. So we consider a material like a piece of soap or tissue, and we zoom in, and if we zoom in a lot, we will see that it consists of a collection of scattering particles embedded in some surrounding material. So for simplicity, we'll do everything in flat length. So the scattering medium is 2D and the sensor is 1D, and so are the speckles. So if we know the exact position of the scattering particles, and we also know where is the illumination and where is the sensor, then the straightforward way to simulate speckles is to just numerically solve the wave equation. But the field is a complex number, and with a camera, we only measure its intensity. Now, to collect statistics, we need to look at different parts of the soap where we have different particles and therefore different speckles. So these exact wave solvers are very accurate, but the problem is that they're also very slow, and in practice, they're tractable only for tiny volumes. And another issue is that this approach requires that we know that we specify the exact position of the scattering particles, and in most cases, we do not have access to this kind of microscopic information, and also often we do not care. And we prefer to describe materials in terms of their statistical properties, such as the density of the scattering particles, the type of the particles, and so on. So to compute speckle statistics using the wave solver, we can consider the following experiment. We have two illumination sources, and we can use the macroscopic material density to sample multiple sets of scatter locations. And for each sample particle position, we use the wave equation solver to compute two scattered fields for the two different illumination directions. So for example, if we look more closely at these two fields, we can see that the field from the blue and green direction are highly correlated but shifted versions of each other. And this is essentially the memory effect. So we compute the outer product of the two fields, which means that we average this outer product over all particle configurations, and this gives us the field covariance. So the ij entry of this matrix corresponds to the average of the blue field at sensor position I times the green field at another sensor position j. So essentially, we have an entry in the matrix for the expected product of each pair of entries in the blue and green fields. Now, notice that the covariance matrix is a strong diagonal, which is shifted from the main diagonal. And this offset is basically the memory effect, because the blue and green fields are most similar when they're appropriately shifted. So we can compute the speckle covariance with this approach, but solving the wave equation is very costly. And we also need to do it multiple times in order to collect statistics to average. So our goal in this work is to compute such covariance matrices more efficiently, way more efficiently. So in contrast to classical wave optics, in computer graphics, we use Monte Carlo methods to simulate scattering. And Monte Carlo methods are based on tracing paths of rays inside the volume. And Monte Carlo algorithms are very fast and efficient, way more efficient than solving the wave equation. And another important aspect is that they only take as input some statistical description of the material, what is known as bulk parameters, rather than an exact particle position as we need to provide to the wave solver. However, classical Monte Carlo methods do not consider wave phenomena, and as a result, they only produce smooth intensity images of scattered light, which show no speckles. And in a sense, we can think of this smooth image as some low-resolution version of a high-resolution speckle image. So in this work, we've extended the efficient Monte Carlo methodology to accurately simulate coherent speckle effects. So since I have many things to show you today, I won't get into the details of this Monte Carlo simulator, but I want to show you some results and some things that we can do with it. So I'll start by showing you covariance matrices computed with our algorithm, And to convince you that it's physically accurate, I compare it to covariance matrices from the exact wave solver. So this is a setup. The scattering media is illuminated by a pair of lighting directions, and it's measured over a range of viewing directions. So in the first case, the two illuminators are both at angle 0. And now I will tilt the second illumination to 4 degrees and here to 20 degrees. So you can see how our covariance matrices are similar to those computed by the exact wave solver. And also notice that when the difference between the illumination direction increases, the dominant diagonal shifts. And this is essentially the memory effect. I mean, when the tilt between the illumination direction is larger, the shift is larger. The shift of the field is larger. Now, finally, I want to say that to compute the covariance matrix using the wave solver, we burn the cluster for a week, while with our algorithm, we can do it in just a few minutes. So the take-home message from this slide is that the Speckle statistics that we compute with our Monte Carlo algorithm are physically accurate, and they are identical to the statistics that we compute with the very inefficient but exact wave solver. Now that we know how to render Speckle covariance, we can also render Speckle images with the same statistics. And for example, here we render Speckle fields for two different materials. The first row is a material with an isotopic phase function, meaning that the probability to scatter in any direction is identical. And the second row is a material with a forward scattering phase function. And notice how the Speckle shift when we tilt the illumination angle. And now it's well known in the Speckle literature that the memory effect holds only for relatively small angles, and also that the exact extent of the memory effect can be very different for different materials. And with our simulation, we can see that. So for example, for the isotopic scattering case, in the third column, we can see that the pattern already changed a bit. But with the forward scattering case, the pattern is preserved even at this larger angle. So having Speckle images, we can also compute how the correlation between Speckle images under different illumination decays. And it tells us the decay of the memory effect correlation as a function of the tilt angle. Now, understanding the decay of the memory effect as a function of angle is a very important problem for many imaging applications. And since there is no good way to simulate it, people are really going to the lab to capture it. And now, there is one approach that researchers are using to provide analytical expression to the decay of the memory effect. And this is using diffusion approximation. But diffusion models are accurate only for in the diffusive regime when the number of scattering events is very high. And in practice, people have observed in lab experiments that the extent of the memory effect is often much wider than the prediction of diffusion theory, but the actual values can only be measured in the lab. Now, using our algorithm, we can efficiently compute the decay of memory effect correlation as a function of tilt angle for all types of scattering parameters. So for example, here we plot the correlation for different phase functions. So we start with isotopic phase function and we continue to a very forward scattering one. Now with the isotopic phase function, the curve matches the theoretical curve from diffusion theory. And this is just another validation that our approach is accurate. Now, for the layer thickness used in this simulation, when the phase function is more forward scattering, the diffusion theory is invalid, and the extent of the memory effect is much wider. Now, of course, even for a forward scattering phase function, you can match diffusion theory. You just need to make the material even thicker than what we considered in this experiment. Now, in the paper, we've evaluated memory effect as a function of many other material and geometry parameters. So our Speckle rendering code is available online, and you are very welcome to try it and bug us with questions. Now, the original paper was already published in 2019, but since the original paper, we've extended the capabilities of this simulator in many ways. So first, in the original paper, we consider the illumination and imaging in the far field, meaning that we had a directional plane wave, and also we view it with a very far sensor. Now, we've extended this to simulate near-field sources, which are essentially located inside the material rather than far behind it. And also, we can image with a camera focused inside the material and not just with a far lensless sensor. These conditions are required in many practical imaging applications. For example, in tissue imaging, when we want to detect fluorescent sources inside the tissue and not far behind it. Another interesting case is correlation between speckle patterns generated when the same scattering slab is illuminated by different wavelengths. So here's an experimental measurement of what is called Chromato axial speckle correlation, which was recently captured by Zhu et al. And here's our attempt to reproduce this experiment with our simulator. Now, the material parameters here are only approximately known, not exactly, but yet our simulator can qualitatively match the empirical observations. Now, in another line of research, we attempt to bypass the simulator and derive an analytic approximation to the memory effect. So in a Monte Carlo simulator, we sample a large space of paths through the material, and these paths have various lengths. However, we show that in many practical cases, we can approximate the correlation by considering only single scattering paths, paths that scattered at a single point. And we show that surprisingly, even for thick materials where many light paths scatter much more than once, then still the correlation can be predicted and explained by these single scattering paths. And the advantage is that the contribution from single scattering paths can be computed in closed form, bypassing the need for Monte Carlo integration, so it's even faster. And we have a poster on this work today, and you're welcome to check it and learn more. Okay, so now I finished the first part of the talk about the physically accurate simulator, and I want to move to the second part and show you an application of some things that we learned from the simulator to develop a better imaging system, in this case, to see inside scattering materials. Okay, so we are interested in imaging algorithms that can see through scattering layers, which means that we want to create a clear image of an incoherent illumination pattern that is hidden from the camera by a scattering layer, such as tissue. Okay, so due to scattering in the tissue, the captured image looks like noise, and in practice it carries little similarity with the hidden illuminators. Yet a previous approach showed that remarkably, due to the memory effect, we can recover the illuminator's layout simply by looking at the speckle autocorrelation. Okay, so this is a very exciting algorithm, which has drawn a lot of attention. It really offers the potential to recover latent sources behind the scattering media when they are completely invisible to our naked eye. But yet, applying it in practice involves some problems. So the first problem is that the width of the objects that we can recover is very limited because the algorithm assumes that there is memory effect correlation between any two source points on the object, and in practice, the range and the extent of the memory effect is very small. A second problem, and that was not well studied in the past, is that the density of the illuminators that our algorithm can recover is very limited because the sources are incoherent with each other, and when more sources are accumulated, the contrast of the speckle pattern decays. Finally, most previous experimental realizations of this idea place the latent object in the far field, meaning that it's a few centimeters behind the scattering layer. And this is very different than what is usually required in a real biomedical imaging application, where we want to detect fluorescent illumination sources which are located inside the object rather than far behind it. And we refer to this as near-field sources. And in this work, we attempt to overcome these three challenges. So to this end, we first use our Speckle simulator and some theoretical analysis to study the memory effect. And we show that in the near field, the memory effect is useful only for samples of modest optical thickness, and it's not useful for very thick scattering layers. Now, it's still interesting because even for modest thickness, there is significant scattering, and it's way beyond what you can see with a standard microscope. But it's important to understand this limit, because then we can focus our research attention in this regime of modest scattering, where there is a potential to make progress. And also, I'm just about to show that for the regime of modest scattering, there are additional properties of the speckles, of the scattering, that we can exploit. So we note the tissue is usually very forward scattering, which means that when light scatters, most of the energy continues in directions which are still close to the original direction. And when the thickness of the scattering layer is modest and the number of scattering events is not so high, the light did not yet scramble completely, and it's still close to the original direction. This means that the speckle pattern is not spread over the entire sensor, but the speckle pattern has local support. Now, it's very different than the image considered by previous far-field approach, where the speckle pattern was very wide and spread over the entire sensor. Now, this local support property is very important, and it's going to be our key for the enhancement of seeing through scattering algorithms. So before I introduce our algorithm, I just want to briefly review the method of Katz et al. For imaging for scattering using the memory effect. So consider a point source behind the scattering medium. So a camera from the other side of the sample will see a bunch of speckles. Now, nearby illumination sources also generate speckle images. And the memory effect property implies that when the displacement between the sources is small enough, the speckle images are shifted versions of each other. Now, if the scene contains three incoherent sources, the camera measures the incoherent summation of their individual speckle intensities. This means that the image I is a correlation of a clean object O with a speckle from a single source that we denote as S. The image I is just a noise-like speckle, and we consider its autocorrelation. Now, S is approximately independent noise, and therefore its autocorrelation is approximately an impulse, making the autocorrelation of I approximately equivalent to the autocorrelation of the hidden object O. And therefore, we can recover O from the autocorrelation of I by using phase retrieval algorithms. Now, I will be referring to this procedure as the full frame algorithm in the rest of this talk. Okay, so this algorithm was originally developed for applications where speckle images cover the entire sensor. But we argue that if the speckle images have local support, as they do under tissue imaging settings, then we can use this property to significantly improve over the full frame autocorrelation algorithm. So to see this, let's revisit how speckle correlation is usually computed. So we have a speckle image like that, and we attempt to detect which sources are present. So we consider different shifts of the image, and we compute the correlation between the original and shifted copy, which basically involves it basically means that we multiply them in sum. But now here is a key difference. Previous algorithm summed over the entire image. But if we know that the speckle spread is local, we also know that the correlation emerged only from this local region. On the other hand, the pixels in this blob are only noise, which will not contribute to the correlation. So if we sum only inside this green window, we can reject the other noise. Now, this may seem to you like a very simple change, but in practice, we prove that it results in an order of magnitude improvement in the signal-to-noise ratio of the correlations that we can detect, and it has a huge impact on the results that we can achieve. So to show the difference between local and global correlations, let's consider this example. So we can compute the full frame autocorrelation, and unsurprisingly, it's noisy. And in contrast, I show you here the local autocorrelation in 3 windows. So it's less noisy. And also, you can also gain some information about the desired shape. And you can see that the local orientation of the arc in each region matches the orientation of the arc. Okay, so let me move to some results. So we built 2 imaging setups corresponding to far-field and to near-field imaging configurations. And we use them to capture speckle images of illuminator patterns occluded by chicken breast tissue layers. So I'll start with results from the far-field setup, and I'll show that even in the far-field setting, if we image layers of modest thickness, and then the speckle patterns still have local support, and we can take advantage of it. So when using a dense illuminator patterns, the original full-frame algorithm completely fails, whereas our local support algorithm successfully recovers the pattern. Now, we checked what is the densest pattern that the full-frame approach could recover. And for this example, it is 16 times sparser. 16 times sparser than what we could do with our local approach. So to understand why handling denser latent images is harder, we can zoom in on a small window from the input image. So when there are fewer illuminators, the speckle pattern has higher variance or better contrast. And this makes the autocorrelation less noisy, so the phase retrieval task is more stable, it's easier. And in our approach, we can handle denser patterns because the local correlations that we compute are less noisy than the full frame correlation, and we have better signal to noise ratio. Now, alternatively, the original full frame algorithm succeeds if we greatly restrict the spatial extent of the illuminators to this small region. Now, the reason that our algorithm can recover patterns with wider memory effect, the reason that our algorithm can recover patterns which are wider than the memory effect range is that it only relies on local correlation between nearby illuminators. It's unlike the full frame algorithm. Unlike the full-frame algorithm, our algorithm does not require that the correlation exists between any pairs of sources. And in particular, it does not assume correlation between 2 sources at the 2 far ends of the pattern. It only relies on local correlation between nearby sources. Okay, so these results demonstrate that our algorithm provides an order of magnitude improvement in both the size and the density of the recoverable patterns. Now, here is another example from a near-field experimental setup. And again, also in the near field, our algorithm can produce significantly better reconstruction, and it works for a much denser pattern compared to the full-frame algorithm. So I'm getting to the end of this talk, and let me summarize it. So in the first part, we've discussed our Speckle simulator, which is physically accurate, and it provides statistics which are equivalent to those obtained by the exact wave solver. But our simulator is an order of magnitude more efficient, and it scales to much larger things. Now, this simulator allows us to understand better understand many properties of the Speckle statistics and use them to develop better imaging systems. And in particular, in the second part of this talk, we use some things that we learned from the simulator to develop a better algorithm for seeing inside scattering tissue. So our algorithm can detect denser and wider illumination patterns. And most importantly, we can detect near sources and not only far ones. And we've demonstrated the new algorithm with multiple lab results. Okay, so thank you for your attention, and please refer to our paper for more details.
All right, thanks, Anat, for that great talk. My name is David Lindell, and I'll be moderating the second session for the CCD workshop today. And I didn't get a chance to introduce Anat before the talk, so let me just do that now with a brief introduction. She's an associate professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering at the Technion. She did her PhD at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem as a postdoc at MIT, as well as assistant associate professor at the Weizmann Institute before she joined Technion. And she's also received numerous awards, including the Blavatnik Award, M. Bruno Memorial Award from the Rothschild Foundation, as well as the Pammy Young Researcher Award, among many others. So we're really delighted to hear from Anat, and we'll go ahead and jump into the Q&A session now. So thanks for joining us live for this, Anat. So I think I had, if there are any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I just have, maybe I can start off with a couple questions of my own. So I've seen some work recently on acousto-optical speckle correlation imaging, which seems really interesting. I was wondering if these simulators, how difficult or challenging is it to simulate speckle under these conditions when you have light passing through an ultrasonic focus, for example, that's frequency shifted. Is that something that's easy to do, or is that
not hard? It's the only challenge about ultrasound that you also have the time domain, like since you're sensitive to the path length. So it's something that at the moment our simulator does not model, like just a time domain. It's not super hard to extend it, just like time we have to get to it. But I think it can very easily be extended. And yes, I agree, there are many interesting applications in the ultrasound domain.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you have, for example, like a pulsed laser that's has a broader spectrum than you would with a continuous source, does this, what implications does that have on the simulation? Do you now need to simulate these separate wavelengths and integrate over that, or are there challenges beyond that?
Okay, so there are a few ways to simulate it. So one way is just like to think of it as a time pulse, and then you need to estimate like path length sensitivity to keep track of your paths and send paths into different beams. The other way to simulate it is, we already have a version which simulated in different wavelengths. So just like simulate the spectrum of your sensor and then average. My guess is time binning will be more efficient in practice. I mean, all of these are doable.
Yeah, and the code is available online, so this is easy to download and play with, it sounds like.
Please do that, and please bug us with questions. We are really looking to see that people are using it.
And maybe I'll just ask one last question about, so it seems like this work also assumes that the scattering medium is homogeneous. Is that right? Or what about extending it to inhomogeneous?
Yeah, so the version that I showed assumes that the scattering media is homogeneous, but we already have an inhomogeneous, heterogeneous version of it. So maybe the version is, the code that I linked is very limited, but there are various extensions that Chen has, and if you're interested, send us an email, and we have many extensions which are not online.
Okay, great. So it sounds like you're far ahead, and anyone who's interested in this or any of these different versions of the simulator can go ahead and contact you.
Yes, please bug us, and we have many variants of the simulator which are not online.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thanks so much for joining us and for your talk. And we'll be back in just a moment with the next talk.